welcome everyone. Welcome everyone. This is the Fan History Project Zoom session. We're going to be doing a program on early Star Trek fandom with Ruth Berman and Devra Langsam. So, Devra, Ruth, welcome to our program. The first thing I'd like to ask you guys, and since Ruth got on first, I'll ask her first. Can you tell us how you got into fandom and when?
I actually became an active fan before I got into fandom. In high school, I was reading a lot of science fiction and also some murder mysteries, and Anthony Boucher's Rocket to the Morgue murder mysteries has all the characters are either science fiction writers or science fiction fans, and he explained in it about science fiction fanzines. So I went to my two best friends in high school, Eleanor Arneson and Ron White, and I said to them, "We are science fiction fans. We should publish a fanzine." We didn't know any other fans to send it to, but we figured there was no reason why we couldn't publish it anyway, give it to friends and family. And so we did that for about a year before I started finding out where fans were and attended my first World Science Fiction Convention, the Detention in Detroit. And at that point, I started exchanging our fanzine, All Mimsy, with other people's fanzines. So that went on for some years, and then along came Star Trek. And people I respected told me, "This is a great show, you must watch it." When I watched it, I said, "Wow." So that's how I got into fandom.
Well, can you tell us again the name of the fanzine, first one?
It started out as WHAB for our initials, and we changed it to All Mimsy with the second issue.
Oh, okay. Because now that I've got know the name, now I got to see if I can ever find a copy of those fanzines. I'm a big collector. Okay, Devra, can you tell us how you got into fandom?
I was great friends with Sherna Comerford. We were big Tolkien fans, and she found out about ESFA because she was living in Newark at the time, going to grad school. And she said to me, "There's this great show. There's this wonderful alien. He has no emotions." And I said, "How stupid." But she dragged me into watching it, and I agreed with her that it was a great show. Then we went to the Open ESFA, which was a small convention, and there we met Brian Burley. I believe he had a photograph of Mr. Spock that he'd gotten from the Paramount publicity department. And we said, "Gosh, wow." And he took us through the Lunarians, where we met many other fans. And then he introduced us to Juanita Coulson, through whom we met Ruth Berman and Eleanor Arneson and Kathy Bushman and Dorothy Jones. And that's how we got involved. And at that point, Juanita and her husband Buck were publishing Yandro. So every now and then she would publish an article about Star Trek, like what the colors of the shirts meant. But she wasn't ready to do a whole magazine. So she said to us, "You are energetic young women and you have good ideas. Why don't you publish a fanzine about Star Trek and I will assist you with the production," which she did because we didn't know squat about producing Mimeo stuff. And she traced the pictures for us and we pasted them into the stencils. And then Sherna got the Rutgers Newark print department to print them for us because they were trying to troll for out of college people that they could sell their printing work to. And then Sherna and I took the uncollated piles of magazines. We'd done 250 copies, which everybody said was insane, to Worldcon in New York and dragooned Ruth Berman and some other people into sitting in our hotel room and collating it. And then, because we didn't know anything, we used my father's wall stapler to staple the fanzines together.
The issue was too big. The issue was too big for an ordinary desktop stapler to use.
It was 45 sheets, which was gigantic. And we stapled the staples into a block of wood, and then somebody pried the staple out with a screwdriver, and somebody else closed the two prongs with a wrench. And
by the end of the evening, that block of wood looked like a sponge.
And that's why some of the original first editions have a problem with the paper, because the wall staples were never meant to go into paper. And then I walked around the convention carrying copies of the fanzines, saying to people, wouldn't you like to buy a fanzine about Star Trek? And some of them did, even though it was 50 cents, which was an enormous amount for a fanzine. And
So this was the first issue of Spockanalia?
that's correct. And we were very lucky that Ruth Berman permitted us to reprint her story, Star Trek, which she had originally published, I believe, in her APA.
That's
But
right.
She was willing to let us reprint it because we hoped we would reach a larger audience. So that was how we did it. Okay,
So
now
I
you
know
talk
why-
about it.
Yeah, now I know why that issue of Spockanalia I have is all chewed up where the staples are.
Yes,
And okay, so your first access was to do things through Star Trek. Ruth, let me get back to you. Before you were, or while you were doing T Negative, I noticed that you were also publishing a fanzine called No. And you were also doing some apazines and some other publications. Can you tell us anything about those?
No, it was originally nous, or nous, depending whether you pronounce it as French, meaning us, or Greek,
Right.
meaning mind. But I was thinking French originally because my co-editor was my sister, Jean Berman.
Mhm.
And when Jean decided she was too busy in school to keep up with it, I thought, okay, it's only half the editorship. I'll cut the name in half. So nous became no.
So you took away the us, just
Right.
made it No. Okay, well,
And I named T negative partly because I thought, oh, I've got a negative thing going here. I'll keep with it.
yeah, well, you were publishing quite frequently, doing two different kinds of fanzines.
I look back on it and I can't understand how I did it.
Well, dedication, I guess. As you guys were getting involved, you've mentioned the first fans that you've met, but when you were involved, particularly, I think both of you have mentioned Juanita. Juanita also ended up publishing at least a short run of a Star Trek fanzine. Can you tell us some other people who were doing, I guess, your competition at the time in Star Trek fanzines? And which ones you liked?
Shirley Meach was doing a sort of a newsletter because there were articles in the regular published movie magazines about Star Trek. So she would list them in her newsletter, and she got artwork, but that was basically the first other fanzine that I knew about.
That was Plactow.
That's
right.
Later on, there were dozens, maybe even 100 different fanzines. And at one point, Linda Deneroff was publishing something called Universal Translator, which was essentially a listing of all the extant fanzines, who had articles in them, what they cost, how you would get them, and the fanzines that were announced but not yet ready. And that was at least a 4-page newsletter.
Linda also published a large-scale Star Trek fanzine called Guardian, I think.
It's hard to remember at this point.
Well, we'll ask her because she is on this program, listening to the program. We'll ask her a little bit later on. when you started watching Star Trek, was there any buzz in fandom about the program, either before it started or right when it started? When did you
Yes, very
really
much
start
so.
hearing it?
There was a lot of buzz because, mostly because B. Joe Trimble got in touch with Gene Roddenberry and told him, you are doing a science fiction show. You really ought to get in touch with the science fiction fans and let them know that you're doing a science fiction show. And if it's any good, you'll get a lot of good publicity from the fans. So she got him to send the pilot episode and costumes to the Worldcon in Cleveland. It was in Cleveland, wasn't it, the Tricon? And they had a costume show to show off the costumes. And they showed the pilot episode, and I walked in near the start and saw Kirk and Spock playing chess, and Kirk making fun of Spock. And I thought, Earthman making fun of Alien, the hell with it, and went out of the room. So I didn't start watching until it actually went on the air. But other people caught on faster.
I was not in fandom at all until Sherna brought me to that ESFA. And then we went to Lunacon and PhilCon and Balticon, but it was all sort of, we were looking for other Trek fans, really. That was what we were looking for. Although we were both very deep science fiction and fantasy readers, we were looking to make contact with other Trek fans.
Well, it seems like you really did, because Trek fandom blossomed very quickly. As you said, there were so many fanzines coming out. I know that one of the Texas universities has got an incredibly large collection of these, and they're still coming out. So you mentioned some of the people. Who were some of your best contributors? Let's start with Devra on this one.
Well, Ruth and Jean Laura and Alicia Austin, artist, and Kathy Bushman, who later married Drew Sanders and moved into costuming fandom, where she blew everybody's minds with all of their outfits. I think Lee Burwasser, but Dorothy Jones, we only had one article from Dorothy Jones, and she moved into T Negative and did stories with Anderson.
Astrid Anderson.
Astrid Anderson.
Dorothy also did a fine poem that you published.
There was the first Nivar, and showing the Vulcan style of two contrasting ideas. And it was beautiful. And then other people picked up the idea of the Nivar, and none of them remembered that she had written the first one.
Oh, okay. Ruth, who were some of your better contributors?
Some of the same ones that Devra's already mentioned. Also Jacqueline Lichtenberg and Anthony Tollin, artist. And actually, I think at this point I'll mention another fanzine that was early, and that's Eridani Triad, published by D. Beadham and Judith Brownlee, and I've forgotten the third editor's name.
Gail Barton.
Right.
Gail was the artist.
Was fiction an immediate staple of your fanzines when you started out?
Yes, it was. In general science fiction fandom, there were a lot of fiction fanzines coming out early, but people pretty quickly realized if you were writing science fiction and it was any good, you could sell it and get money for it. And if it wasn't any good, who wanted to read it? So although Ray Bradbury published a lot of fiction in his early fanzines, he discovered soon that he could sell it and have more fun that way. And as a result, pretty soon, science fiction fans said, we don't want fiction in our fanzines. If it's good, you can sell it. But when Star Trek came along, you couldn't sell your Star Trek stories professionally. You'd be violating copyright and you'd get in trouble legally. Meanwhile, there was this very large audience of people who wanted to read more Star Trek stories than the Star Trek series alone could give them. have a friend in Sherlock Holmes fandom who says, I would rather read bad Sherlock Holmes stories than not have any new Sherlock Holmes stories to read.
That makes sense. And of course, these people had read their stories to their friends, but they wanted to reach more people. And we gave them, well, they sent their stories to us and we edited them. And we said, this doesn't make sense. You should fix this plot line. And that's terribly ungrammatical. You really ought to correct that, so that they had a workshop, a training ground. And I wrote down a list of some of the people who first published fanzines who have currently gone on to become professional authors. And they're not writing Star Trek stories, they're writing their own stories. And let me dive down and get my list. This is just off the top of my head. These people all moved into professional writing, having done an apprenticeship in Trek fanzines. Jean Laura, Jacqueline Lichtenberg, Ruth, Eleanor Arneson, Lois Bugeaud, who published her own fanzine, Lillian Stewart Carl, India Edgehill, which is Barbara Wenck, Diane Duane, Dorothy Jones Height, Roberta Rogo, and Sandra Measle. And these are just people that I thought of in an instant, rather than there are probably others that I haven't thought of.
Well, that's quite a list. As you were editing them, they were learning, and I guess you were learning as well as to be an editor. When did any of these people do their own Star Trek fanzines as well? You mentioned Lois, or were they mostly contributing to yours and others?
I think Jacqueline was writing a lot of, she had the Crace series. I don't know that she published it herself, but she certainly wrote a great many Crace stories. And then other people picked up the universe that she had created, and they wrote their own Crace stories. And they were published by somebody who printed many copies. And then some people wrote anti-Crace stories because they didn't agree with some of the things that Jacqueline had thought of. Linda Deneroff, of course, was publishing her own fanzine. And Roberta Rogo was publishing a magazine whose name I'm sorry, I forget. She accepted stories from younger people and helped them. I was a kind of a snob about it. You know, this is not good enough for me. But she published a lot of younger authors and helped them a great deal.
I think I should mention a writer who did not write Star Trek fan fiction and used to get annoyed if people said she got started writing Star Trek fan fiction. And that's Vonda McIntyre, who didn't write Star Trek fan fiction, but she was the vice president of the James Doohan fan club.
She did eventually, I believe, write Star Trek
professionally.
Fiction professionally, yes. Okay. The conventions came on years after the show was off. How did that change the fandom that you were involved with? Ruth, you want to start with that?
No, because I didn't go to Star Trek conventions until somewhat later. Devra was in on the first one.
Okay.
Helped organize it.
Devra?
Elise Rosenstein, Elise Pines at that time, and I were in my house looking at film clips because Roddenberry gave Bijou a great many pieces of film from the cutting room floor. And Bijou distributed them to fans and people traded them. Oh, that's a great picture. I want that. And artists wanted to have the clips so they had a good reference to do their realistic portraits from. But anyway, Elise and I were sorting film clips, and one of us said, it would be so nice if we could have a convention that was just Star Trek. Then we wouldn't have people saying to us, you're so tedious, we don't want to hear about Star Trek anymore. You're not interested in real science fiction. And I said, oh yes, that would be a nice idea. And then about 4 days later, Elise called me and said, I've got us a hotel and a printer. And it was like holding on to the back of a runaway carriage. At that point, we had a lot of acquaintances and friends who had bought our fanzines, and we'd met them at other science fiction conventions. And we told them, oh, we're going to have a little convention. And Joan Winston, who was working for one of the networks, was able to put us in contact with Roddenberry. And he brought a whole bunch of the actors, and he brought the blooper reel. And Joan also made contact with NASA, which sent us a gigantic exhibit and somebody to put it up. So we had all this NASA stuff. And because we had gone to Lunacon and PhilCon, we knew what a convention should have. It should have an art show and panels and a costume ball and a dealer's room. And so we arranged for all of those things for our convention. And we got advance registration of 800, which was gigantic in terms of comparison with other science fiction conventions. And we thought, Lunacon usually doubles its advance registration. So maybe we'll have 1,500 people. Oh my God, wow. And we prepared for 2,000. I believe we got somewhere between 3,200 and 3,400 attendees, and we ran out of everything. Everything. We were pasting stars onto little pieces of paper and pinning them onto people with pins because we had no badges left. And at the end, we just said, put your name and address on this piece of paper and drop it in the box, and we'll get back to you. And then somebody stole the box. So we don't know actually exactly how many people, but that was our best guess. And then we went and did it again 4 more times. We must have been absolutely insane.
Well,
it was
was the
so
most
much
popular
work.
convention. Yeah, seemed to be the most popular convention, and I had heard references that you guys were absolutely flabbergasted about how many, but I didn't really know the exact numbers. So thanks for giving us some idea of how it was going. And Ruth, how did you get involved with things like Inside Star Trek?
Well, after I'd been watching Star Trek a few weeks, I called up Eleanor Arneson and said, you've got to come watch this with me. So she came, and after we'd been watching a little while, she said, you know, we could write that. So we started working on scripts. And at some point, I got sick of my school. I was in the graduate program at the University of Minnesota. And I ran away to Los Angeles and tried to get my scripts read, which I did eventually, but they were turned down. And at that time, Bijo Trimble and her husband John were setting up Lincoln Enterprises, Star Trek Enterprises, which was the company that Gene Roddenberry wanted to have set up to sell Star Trek souvenirs and answer fan mail, and belonged to Majel Barrett, who was then his girlfriend, but not yet his wife. And he wanted her to have a business to own herself that would give her some kind of financial stability, probably. So one of the things they wanted to have was a fanzine inside Star Trek. And I edited that and wrote most of it. And in the course of doing that, I got to visit the set quite often and took notes on a lot of things that there wasn't room for in Inside Star Trek. So when Star Trek went off the air and I went back to Minneapolis and got back into the graduate program, that was when I started my fanzine T Negative to tell about all those visits to the set. I call them set twos, and published the stories that I'd been writing. And other people started offering me their stories to publish, so T Negative kept going for quite a long time.
And I do want to tell people that a lot of issues of T Negative and all of Spockanalia, and we're adding Mazaphon D, are on the FANAC website. So if you'd like to see what some of these fanzines look like, and you haven't already, you can certainly read them there.
I think I should go back and tell the story of Star Trek, because at that
Okay.
time, when Star Trek came out on the air, I had not been writing any fiction. When I graduated from college, I looked at what I've been writing, stories and poems, and I said to myself, well, these poems are pretty good and they're getting better, but the stories are bad and they're not getting any better. They're just all of them bad. I'm not a fiction writer. I will give up. So I did for a couple of years there. And then Star Trek came along and I just couldn't resist telling myself stories about the characters. And one of the ideas that I was making a story about seemed stronger than others. So I started writing it down. I started writing it down in the middle of a class where I wasn't understanding the paper that was being read. One of the other students had written a paper on church architecture. And after I asked her to define apse and I asked her to define nave, I realized I was the only Jew in the class. I was the only one who didn't know anything about churches. And if I asked her to explain everything I didn't know, we would be there forever. So I stopped paying attention and started writing my story. When I finished writing the story, I said, well, that's pretty good. I should do something with it. And I published it in Pantapon, my apicine. And Juanita Colson said I should send a copy to Devra. So that's how that got started. But then a couple of years later, I looked at it again. I said, really, that is quite a good story. And furthermore, it doesn't have to be a Star Trek story. Instead of a spaceship, it could be an airliner. And I rewrote it as a fantasy story called Ptolemaic Hijack and sent it off to Worlds of Fantasy, which was a sister magazine to Galaxy and Worlds of If. And some time went by and I hadn't heard anything, so I sent them a letter saying, well, what happened? Is the manuscript lost? And they wrote back and said, oh, well, it must be lost. We can't find it. Terribly sorry. Why don't you resubmit it? So I typed it up, grumbling all the way. And just when I finished retyping it, a check arrived in the mail. The reason they couldn't find the story was that it was off at the typesetters being typeset. And the issue came out a couple months later, and that was my first professional sale.
Wow. That's amazing.
It is. That's an incredible way of getting things, finding out about your sale.
At that
Speaking
point, I
of,
realized that I could write some fiction, although I am more a poet than a fiction writer.
One thing I'd like to mention is what Roberta Rogo did, which was Trek's Index, because people wanted to find a particular story, and she, being a librarian and having a tidy mind, produced indices to where various stories could be found. I believe that there were 5 or 6 volumes of this. And the other thing we should mention is Joanna Cantor's In a Plain Brown Wrapper, which was Grupp, which was the first adult Trek zine, because most of us were extremely proper and did not publish warm stories. So,
well, that does bring up a question that someone had suggested we ask about the origins of some of the adult fiction, like slash fiction. Can you tell us about some of those, where that came from?
the problem was that when you have 2 charming, beautiful male leads, you can't decide which one you want your character to have. And you don't want to share either of them with those boring people like Christine Chappell. So you will write a story in which they are involved. I don't believe that most of the people who wrote slash were gay. Some of them I don't think had the faintest idea what male sex was like. But they wanted to have their 2 best characters together, and so they wrote it. And for years and years and years, we concealed with great effort the fact that these things existed because we were a little embarrassed, unsure. But then Donna Andrews, who wrote the book We'll Always Have Parrots. It's a murder mystery involving a cult TV show, has one of the characters showing the police officer some of the slash, and that was in a professionally published book, so we couldn't hide it anymore.
Ah, I didn't know how it came out in public. That's something I'm actually glad to find out, although I had never actually read any of that particular fiction. I was not reading Star Trek fiction. I was one of those snobs who knew about it, but thought it was probably just poor amateur fiction. And I later read some of it, and then there is some good stories in some of those fanzines.
Some of it was very good.
Yeah.
Very good indeed. Ruth,
yeah.
Who was it that published the collection of fan stories? The professional? I don't remember.
Star Trek: The No Voyages, you mean? That was, it'll come back to me in a moment.
Did Fred Pohl do that?
No.
Well,
that was a
Bantam published it, but the editors were two Star Trek fans.
And that was a collection of original.
Sandra Marshak, and I'm still blank on the other editor.
Ah, yes. That
Okay.
was some very good stories in there.
At the time, Joanna Russ wrote a review of it in which she said, this is juvenile stuff and a lot of amateur nonsense. And a few years later, she published an article about slash fiction saying, oh, this is wonderful. And I thought, gee, I wish she'd noticed that earlier.
Well, I guess we all have to live and learn. You had mentioned you're going back to school. Did either of you, did any of this fan material have any effect on your educational work or areas where you went on to education?
Not directly. The academic articles that I've written have tended to be about science fiction and fantasy more than science fiction.
Okay.
I should mention that I'm not an academic because I got my degree when the job market for academics collapsed, but I remain in what's called an independent scholar.
Okay.
I was out of library school and I didn't do any more educational stuff, although I did exhibit photos that we got from the network in the library that I worked at. Put a sign downstairs in the adult section saying Star Trek material upstairs, which my boss was not thrilled about, but we did get some people coming up to look at it. But that's about the closest I can.
Well, Star Trek fanzines have had a almost a commercial aspect to them, with seemingly from the beginning, with multiple reprints, things, as you mentioned, for sale, much different than traditional fanzines, which were mostly on an exchange basis. And if you were, you put a sticky quarter or a dime or whatever in the mail, someone would send you one. But did that affect how you were doing the fanzines or what you were putting in them?
Nope.
The fact that you were being commercial about them?
Nope. I funded the magazine out of my salary, and the first one was selling for 50 cents. This is not a commercial. And the reason that we did reprints is that people kept sending us begging letters. We did 250 copies of the first printing of Spockanalia. And after we sold them out, people wrote us letters saying, we want this. So we went back and reprinted it. And eventually the stencils fell apart. And I found a commercial printer who took the mock-ups, the dummies that I had made to do the magazine from, and he reprinted them offset. And I think probably I made about a total of about 5,000 copies of each issue of Spockanalia. but I have discarded my paperwork and I can't verify it.
Oh, that's an incredible number of copies for any fanzine. So good for you. It sounds like the Star Trek fandom really got big after you started doing the conventions, or was it actually growing in leaps and bounds before that?
It
You
was
had,
it was big before that, but it got wildly big after.
how, when did you guys realize that Star Trek fandom was so big that it was almost a completely different entity than the traditional fandom?
I don't think we realized that it grew.
It just grew.
Yeah.
After we had done 5 conventions, we said, that's enough. It's too much work to be a hobby and it's not enough money to be a job, because there were 15 of us on the committee and the amount of money we made was really quite pathetic. Yes, it looked like a lot, but after you've paid the bills and you split it 15 ways, it's really nothing. So then Townsley took up doing it, and Creation Con. And since they were single people, they made enough money for it to be worth their while. But we just, it wasn't that we didn't like the people anymore. It just got to be too much.
Mm-hmm. Well, I can understand that. There are always projects that once you take them on, you don't realize how big and how much work they really entail. What do you think were some of the bigger events that affected you as you were doing this various Trek activities? What remains in your head as memorable?
The petition that people signed at our first convention begging us to do another one. I don't know where it ever went, but there were a lot of people signed it. And it was gratifying knowing that so we had made so many people happy doing that.
Okay, so initially you were doing this as a one-shot convention.
Yes,
Okay.
we were.
Ruth,
Surprise.
yeah. Ruth, do you have any particular things that stick out in your mind then?
Well, Star Trek, obviously, and writing up the series of visits to the set for T Negative. That was a lot of fun to do because it was such pleasant memories. And
Well, you had so many issues. I noticed early on the T negatives that you were talking about the visits to the set, but there were so many issues. How did you keep them going with all of that?
people kept contributing material.
Dorothy Jones and Astrid Anderson wrote a great series.
I even had to tell Jacqueline Lichtenberg at one point, you're writing so much, so fast. If I publish the whole Craith series, I won't be able to publish anything else. So I told her, you really need to publish the Craith series on its own as an entity. And I stopped publishing the Craith stories at that point, because if I kept up with it, I wouldn't have been able to do the other stories that people were sending me that were also good.
Well, it sounds like they were really or she especially was really prolific about it. There are so many different iterations of Star Trek series. Did any of them attract your interest, or did they create additional subsections of Star Trek fandom?
They've created additional subsections, but for me, the later series, Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, I enjoyed them immensely. I still watch the reruns of them on the H&I channel, but they never made me feel I want to tell stories about what's going on in the characters' heads. I can't tell in advance what will make me say, I need to tell a story about that. Enjoying a series is not the same thing as wanting to write about it.
I never cared for Next Gen. The only one of the other series that I liked was Deep Space Nine, and they had so much difficulty dealing with women and with adult relationships that after a while I just gave up on them. After they killed Kira's lover 5 different ways to make sure he could never come back, I said, this is a stupid idea. What, here you have a talented biologist and the only thing you can do with her is have her teach 2nd graders. So I just really stopped watching them.
Were there any other, talking about problems in some of the shows, were there any dichotomies within the original Trek that got brought up in fanzines and in fanish circles? Because there wasn't always perfect logic in the shows, despite our Mr. Spock.
No,
It was never perfect logic, so
Okay. At least that, you admitted to that, although some people just do seem to think that Mr. Spock was perfect.
well, hey, they have their problems, but many people took the anomalies in the canon, the places where they contradicted themselves, and felt they had to write a story to explain that. So
a lot of fan fiction is a form of criticism. You say, this doesn't work. This detail does not work. How could we explain it? And the explanation involves pointing out why it doesn't work, as well as coming up with an explanation, so that the story is a story, but it's also criticism.
Yeah. Okay.
there was a great deal of discussion about what Spock's father meant when he said it was a logical thing to do to marry Spock's mother. And in fact, Ruth wrote a charming story explaining that, but there were also many other stories explaining that, and doing better perhaps than the TV show could have ever done.
Well, I guess when you're have so many people giving input, there can be so many variations that somebody might come up with a logical explanation. Okay. Do want to ask if you've got any specific things that you would like to bring up while we're doing it before we start looking at questions, because we've had a number of comments in the chat.
No, maybe we should go to the questions.
Okay. Let's see who we've got on the chat that, okay, I'm going to do this almost in reverse order because the way the chat shows up on here. Linda, you mentioned Jean Laura's Night of the Twin Moons. What was that about?
Jean, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay. Jean Laura wrote probably the best Sarek and Amanda stories. And the first zine that she did was Night of the Twin Moons, but she wrote several other zines. And one of the professional Trek novels by Jean is actually in the Night of the Twin Moons series.
Okay.
But it was basically Sarek and Amanda stories, and they were really, really good.
Where did they appear?
We were very impressed by it. We were reading it in the airplane on the way home from Media West Con and saying, oh God, did you read that chapter? Isn't this wonderful? It was one of the best zines I've ever read. So.
Okay. Ben mentions that Hal Clement fixed Trek science at conventions. Ben, do you wanted to explain that?
Sure. Basically, what he would do at the Trek cons is he would take one of the episodes with with absolute garbage science. You know, this astronomy doesn't work. This planetary science doesn't work. And he would say, okay, let us assume that in fact, Roddenberry and his team were correctly describing things. What do I have to do to make this planetary system work? And he would give an hour-long lecture in which he would, you know, put in a spare moon or something to make the gravitational field work a little bit differently than it normally would, or put in some other techno fix so that you ended up, oh, absolutely, the science of this was right. Roddenberry hadn't quite gotten around to explaining how this system was built, and he did it the way only Hal could, because he would sit there and work. Basically, he would say, the same way that he did when he was writing hard science fiction, and would say, okay, what do I need to do to make this story element actually work scientifically? He was stuck with Roddenberry's garbage science and then said, okay, what do I have to do to make it work? And they were marvelous.
Did he ever, Ruth, Devra, did he ever write any of those up for any of your fanzines or any others you
Yes,
know about?
yes, I published one, and Devra, I think you published some.
No, we basically published fiction. Our assumption when we published Spockanalia was that Star Trek was the real world, and we were describing, excuse me, things that really happened, and we didn't want to publish reviews of somebody's record, or we published one review of a Star Trek record, but all the other ones were essentially fictional, even though we had some fictional descriptions of the Vulcan heart and circulatory system. But
Hal Clement did write up several of his articles and sent them, I think, one to each, a different fanzine each time.
maybe Juanita did some of them in her 2 volumes.
That sounds right.
I don't remember.
Bill Kartolopoulos asks, did you guys ever encounter any hostility to Trek fandom at General SF cons before
Yes.
the Star Trek cons took off?
Yes, it was understandable because there were so many Star Trek fans that if the science fiction convention said, put in as much Star Trek material as the Star Trek fans wanted, there wouldn't have been much room for anything else. So it got testy. They would say, we don't want to do any Star Trek material.
Yeah, basically. And a lot of the guys looked at these women. My God, it's a girl. And they couldn't believe that we were really interested in anything beside Mr. Spock's ears. And so they were a little snide, you might say. But I think it was a great deal of it was the fact that they felt crowded, that we were pushing their topics and their ideas out of the way so we could do all Star Trek, which is in fact why we wanted to do our own convention.
Yeah, okay, understandable. Linda Deneroff mentioned that you were looking at the editor of the new voyages. She says it was Myrna Colbreth.
That's right.
Yes, yes. And they were basically stories that had been published in fanzines and were very good.
Okay, the Star Trek Concordance. You guys have any, it's mentioned several times in the chat. Do you guys have any comments on that?
That started out as a project by Dorothy Jones. And when she showed it to Bijo Trimble, Bijo said, well, you know, there's probably a professional market for this. So Bijo edited it, and that was published by, help me there, who published it? Valentine or Bantam, one of them. Valentine.
Okay, you mentioned Bijo, and she's been mentioned several times. I'm going to take this opportunity to tell people that Bijo will be on one of our Zoom sessions, I believe in May, and she'll be talking with John about their fanish careers, and I'm just putting the plug in now. Jerry Kaufman you asked a question early on about going to conventions. Can you elaborate what you wanted to know?
Well, although, Ruth, when you asked about what effect the conventions had on Star Trek fandom, and Ruth said, well, she didn't go to the earlier Star Trek conventions, but I was thinking there might have been an effect on the Star Trek fandom of the time that could be observed even by a non-attendee, and that was there an increase in the number of fanzines being produced, or the number of people who wanted to contribute or read Star Trek fanzines? So did you notice any change in the fanzine community because of the increased number of people who had gone to conventions?
I didn't notice a change. There may have been a change, but didn't impinge on me.
I think there were just a great many people who said, I have an idea. I could write a story. It could be, I could do it better than they're doing that, especially the third season, which had some
Oh, well, yeah,
notable.
but your conventions didn't start until after the series was over. So I was wondering, so did you see an increase in those people wanting to write stories because they had attended the conventions and knew that there was a place for them?
I think there was, Jerry. I know I was sitting at a Lunarians meeting one night, and Larry Carmody got up and said there were only 50 fanzine fans in the entire United States.
What?
And exactly, Devra. We looked at him and said, excuse me? Because he was refusing to recognize that there were a lot of Star Trek fans and Star Trek fanzines out there.
If I can break in, I wrote a book called Boldly Writing, which is a history of Star Trek fandom and Star Trek fanzines. And there is a graph in that I made up and put in that book. And fanzines took off after the publication of Star Trek Lives, which was a professional book by Jacqueline Lichtenberg and Joan Winston, and one other author whose name is escaping me at the moment. She mentioned fanzines in there. And after that, because the book was such a huge bestseller, many, many people discovered there are fanzines. And there was also the address of the Star Trek Rail Committee where they could write for information about fanzines, and our mailroom took off. But after that, I had what I called the fanzine explosion. The number of fanzines just took off like anything after the publication of Star Trek Lives, because it was mentioned in there, because it was a bestseller.
Can you post a link? Can you post a link to the chart?
Well, the chart is in the book, so you'd have to buy the book in order to see the chart, but I can post a link to the book.
Okay. That's not the same book is that the book that Mad Dog is showing? No, it's a different book.
It was a fan. Joan published it as part of her publishing house. And I don't know whether it was ever done in a professional book, but certainly
it is a professional book. It has an ISBN and everything.
That's good.
It's definitely a professional book.
Wasn't published by one of the major.
It wasn't published by one of the mainstream publishers, no.
Sometimes it's.
I just wanted to clarify, Sandra Marshak was the third author on Star Trek Lives.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have my book list in front of me on my computer, so I can check these things easily.
And one of the things we should mention, since Joan brought it up, was the Well Committee. After Jacqueline and the others did Star Trek Lives, Jacqueline was sort of snowed with people writing to her saying, this is wonderful, how do I get involved? And she made up the Well Committee, which consisted of volunteers like Joan and Shirley Majewski, who wrote to all these unfortunate people who lived in very, very small towns and couldn't find anybody else to talk about Star Trek with. And it lasted for, 10 or 15 years until the internet made it possible to make contact other ways. It may have been more than 15 years.
It was 25.
It was a great thing.
All right, I'm going to go back again, trying to pick up some of these questions. One that Lloyd Plenty asked was that Star Trek Index what was turned into the Concordance?
No,
No, the index was simply an index to stories in different books, different fanzines. The Concordance was like an encyclopedia. So that was the basic difference.
Okay. Bill also had a question. Were there periods when different types of material became more prominent in the Star Trek fanzines? Whether it was news, analysis, fanfic / did it change over time, or was there just so many fanzines out there that everything was coming at once?
it was almost mostly fiction. When slash stories started getting published, they dominated for quite a while. There got to be a lot of crossover stories as other things like Star Wars, Doctor Who, Blake Seven. There are quite a few crossover stories with people who say, I want to have those beat Star Trek.
Okay. The next question is a little more personal. Which each of you, and maybe I'll ask Devra first since we just answered, what type of material did you prefer? You mentioned fiction already, but was there any specific subjects or areas you liked to read and to publish?
Well, I think I liked action stories, possibly with a little romance in them, but I never published any of the warm stories because they embarrassed me. Once in a while, we would publish a nonfiction article, like somebody did an article for us about an excavated pot from Vulcan, and they had it just like a real archaeological article with diagrams of the pot and the measurements of the thickness of the foot, but basically it was just the action fiction.
Okay, Ruth?
I don't know.
Okay. Randy Smith early on, it said you mentioned primarily mentioning women. Were there any men in the Star Trek fan areas?
Yes, mostly in art, I think. Anthony Tollin, Greg Jean, George Barr.
Well, there was Winston Howlett. He published a fanzine about Uhura mostly. And when they did the Gilbert and Sullivan takeoffs at Media WestCon, he would do Lieutenant Uhura in drag, which was always amazing to see. There was someone who published a newsletter on how to do a good publication. And his name was Gene, and we assumed it was a woman, but it wasn't. We all felt very silly. And I don't remember the name of the magazine he did, but it was How To.
Okay.
There was also Alan Asherman was a cartoonist.
All right.
We could mention Phil Folio.
Oh, Phil, yeah.
He was quite active in fandom.
It does sound like many of the men were involved in the art rather than in the
stories.
most
Yes.
of the stories,
And,
right?
and we should mention Jim and Melody Rondeau, who did a fanzine called Clipper Trade Ship for people who are getting Star Trek clips,
Film clips.
film clips from Lincoln Enterprises and wanted to trade them with other people. But since they were doing that anyway, they published a lot of articles and occasionally fiction.
There was a certain amount of bootlegging on both the film clips and the magazines. The film clips were pieces of TV film, but you could take them to your local photography shop and have them print you a copy, as long as you made sure they knew the emulsion was on the wrong side. Otherwise, they'd print them backwards. But people would copy favorite clips and sell them.
Actually, I like to have them printed the wrong way around because the color and the details show up more finely when it's done that way.
But there was also a problem. There were some very popular magazines, especially some of the adult ones, where people would Xerox them and sell them, even though it wasn't their magazine. And one of the things that this gentleman named Gene was recommending was that you could put a special seal onto each copy of your magazine to ensure that nobody could copy it and sell it illicitly.
A special watermark type of
Yes.
thing.
Yes.
Okay. And now that we've gotten the lesson, fine-tuned lesson on how to avoid copyright, let's go back to something older. Sue Kisenweather asked early on about elements from fanzines. Sue, are you still with us? Can you bring up your question?
I am. Hi. I was wondering about how you felt about when elements from fanzines made it into later iterations of Star Trek. You know, I know one of the really famous examples is the design of the Saylat, right? But even more recently, without spoiling anything for anyone who may want to watch it, the concept of Nivar, which you brought up, plays a big role in Discovery Season 3. So even today, they're calling back to a lot of fan-created works. And do you feel like fans are being stolen from, or do you feel like the creators are paying tribute? Just, I'm wondering how you all
It's more
take that
tribute.
sort of thing.
It's more tribute. It's not directly stealing the material, but taking the concept and expanding on it.
It was.
Go ahead.
We were pleased that they noticed us enough to look at our ideas and say, oh, well, that's not bad. So at the beginning, we had a moderately close relationship with Roddenberry and the writers, and we used to send them copies of the magazines so that we couldn't very well complain about their liking our ideas and using them when we were using their ideas.
Actually, that the TV studios were not allowed to open and read these things because they did not want to be accused of plagiarism or stealing original material from the fanzines to be used in their show because they could get sued. So, and Paramount had a very strange relationship with fans, because while in the beginning they had a really good relationship with Joan Winston and Devra and Ruth, most times there were occasions when they would go after a fanzine and try to shut them down. And then there would be petitions, and mostly we would just ignore Paramount, because Paramount would either ignore us or try to shut us down. And then they would come out with something, oh, well, we can't have any fanzines. So they would write letters and there'd be cease and desist, and pretty much we ignored it.
The funny thing is that I used to have a newspaper clipping that showed Gene Roddenberry holding a copy of my fanzine. You could see the name of it. So I don't know whether they actually read them or maybe they just looked at the pretty pictures. It's hard.
Well, it might have been after the show was canceled, in which case then there was no problem.
But what Linda says is true. But there were ways that you could, there are still ways that you could get some influence. For instance, I was the co-coordinator of Alexander Siddig's fan club in when Deep Space Nine was on. We had a good relationship with at least the staff. That's not the Paramount executives, but the staff. And if you noticed in some of the later Deep Space Nine, there was a mention of the Pennington School, which was named after Star Trek fanzine publisher Lana Pennington of New Zealand. So things like that still crept into the show even afterwards.
The character Geordie LaForge was named after a fan whose name was Geordie.
Oh. Okay, Fred Lerner, you had a question?
Yeah, I was around during the 60s, of course. In fact, I have a vague recollection that I attended that first Star Trek convention. I'm wondering, which do you think had the larger demographic impact on fandom? Star Trek or the publication of The Lord of the Rings in paperback?
They both had a very large effect. I don't know if it would be easy to gather statistics to try to compare them and say that one was larger than the other.
Well, if you look at the growth of general or specialized fanzines afterwards, although there were a number of Tolkien, there are far more Star Trek fanzines that have been published over the years than anything else.
It's really hard to quantify because there may not have been any Tolkien fanzines, but look at the number of fantasy books that exploded after Tolkien. Today, most science fiction bookshelves in stores are more fantasy than science fiction. So it's really hard to quantify. I mean, Star Trek is out there. It's in the public literature. Words have been absorbed into the culture, you know, beam me up and things like that. So it's really not quantifiable.
Well,
Well-
except for the fact that you can see the big demographic change. If you look at pre-Trek, fandom was largely male. Since Trek fandom was so significantly female, when the two cultures merged, you ended up with an overall fanish male-female ratio that's much closer to 50-50 than you ever saw in the pre-Trek fandom days.
But what's very funny is that newspaper reporters always picked out the fat guy with the coat covered with buttons and said, here's your typical fan, which is not true. I don't even think it's true for non-Trek fandom, but that's just one of those things.
Or they'd pick out the scantily clad female from the masquerade.
But
Those
no,
are the two images.
the one who shouldn't have been scantily clad.
Sometimes they did that, very often. But then again, they're doing that to focus on the point they want to make. And usually those articles are not ones that were complimentary to the fandom.
Yeah.
Okay.
The rule is if somebody's likes something more than I do, they must be crazy.
You know, I think that's a very good statement.
I just wanted to mention, you spoke about the collections before. That would be Texas A&M and also the University of Iowa. Both of them are actively seeking people to send them fanzines that they can add to the collection and that they can digitize.
Yes, my fanzine collection has all been shipped to the University of Iowa, and I have my own special collection with my own name on it.
And the Texas A&M collection is primarily focused on various media productions, not just Star Trek, but other media fandoms that have done and produced fanzines.
Another effect of Star Trek was that that there had never been fanzines for television shows before. And so when after Star Trek fanzines, all of a sudden you had Starsky and Hutch. I know Starsky and Hutch. I know there were several other jobs. Quantum Leap.
Oh, there were quite a few.
Yeah. So
even the Wild Wild West had quite a few fanzines.
There were a few fanzines devoted to shows before the Star Trek ones, but they were a very specific person. Like Dick Schultz in Detroit did an Avengers fanzine called On Guard,
Right.
which ran for, I don't remember, 6 or 7 issues, maybe a little, maybe more, but not too much more.
Yeah.
Because I got one of those at one of my first conventions, like 66 or 67. So
Yeah,
that
Schultz-
was one unusual one.
Right. The 6 issues of On Guard are also online at fanac.org. got to make our plugs as when we can get them. First issue of which was called Rigger Digger, because it was primarily his interest was in Diana Rigg. Then he
Well,
broadened it when he found out he had more audience than he thought.
At one point, there were several fans who were doing collections. There was Memory Alpha, but unfortunately, and they asked you to send them a copy and they would store it forever. But unfortunately, that didn't last. I don't know what happened to the collections, but at least one of them, the person became interested in Star Wars, and she sold all of her Trek collection. That wasn't really hers. It was the fanzine that she was supposed to be holding so she could buy Star Wars stuff. We were not pleased.
Doesn't Memory Alpha still exist online?
Don't know.
There is something called Memory Alpha online, but I'm not sure if it's the same outfit.
But we should mention Archive of Our Own, which I can't really talk about because I only know it exists. So, Linda, can you?
Yeah, I know it won a Hugo Award last year. I tried using it, but I'm as much as I know computers, it beat me. You have to. It has tags, and you can really delineate what you're looking for in a story, and they will publish. You know, they don't publish. They will store just about any fanzine story. They're ultra liberal about what they will take, and but I don't really know.
Yeah, one of the criticisms of that was the fact that it was so open to be that almost any kind of material can be on there. The other criticism about voting and such for the Hugo, I can't really comment on since I never looked at the way it was handled.
Yeah, if they're not fanzines in the sense that they're publishing a magazine. They are publishing individual stories.
Yeah, if I could jump in on Archive of Our Own, actually, I know a little bit more about this area. My understanding, they didn't win as a fanzine or for a story. They won as a special project because it's self-coded. So the people who use the archive are the ones who coded the archive. And
It's best-related work.
Right.
One is best-related work, yes.
So it's not for any particular thing. It's more for the project itself of Archive of Our Own, because they were dealing with websites like fandom.com or fanfiction.net that were censoring stories or taking stuff down or claiming the rights to them. So one of the great things with Archive of Our Own is that if you post a story there, you retain the rights to it. Nobody's going to try and take it and sell it or take it away from you. But of course, as you said, because it is an open platform, there are no editors and there is no editorial process. So anybody can put anything they want up there.
And I didn't mean to imply that you know, I'm on.
No, I didn't take it that way. But I mean,
I'm on the Mark Protection Committee for Worldcon, so believe me, I did not mean to imply that 50,000 fans own a Hugo. No,
right.
It's the archive that won for its existence, not for individual pieces of work.
Right. And it of course increases access, but it also means because there's no editorial process, you know, you could get something that blows your mind next to something that you might be surprised to be reading, something that you'd never see in a fanzine with an editor.
Right.
Not perhaps the best written story available. When we did our fanzines, we did edit them, and we had a reputation for being bloodthirsty.
I don't think I was bloodthirsty, but there was one woman who sent me a story, and it was what we called a Mary Sue. For those who don't know the definition, Mary Sue is where you write yourself in as a character and you're the most beautiful person in the world. You have the most exquisite clothing. You can out Captain Kirk, and you can out Spock, Mr. Spock in your scientific thinking. And
youngest yeoman, youngest lieutenant in the fleet.
And this woman sent me this story, and I edited it. I mean, she had a nice kernel of a story, but it needed work. And I sent it back to her with a lot of heavy editing and notes. And she wrote me back and said, but all my family and my teachers loved it. And I said, but they're not your editor. And then she said, only one other person has criticized the story the way you did. And it was another fanzine editor. So I don't know whatever became of this woman. I hope that she wasn't destroyed by us. I tried not to, and I think I succeeded in not making any personal critiques. It was just, the verbiage and the structure of the story that we were editing. And it, most people took it in the spirit in which it was intended.
The interesting thing was that once in a while you'd get a piece of art and you'd look at it and say, that man has 2 elbows on 1 arm. And you'd say something to the artist and the artist would be incredibly insulted. And it was my feeling that people were used to having their writing criticized in school, and so they mostly took it in good part, but most of the artists didn't have that kind of training, even though some of them were really great portraitists, but they were not used to having people point out problems to them.
Okay, well, we are beginning to run out of time. I am going to ask Ruth and Devra to just tell us if you're basically one last statement, but with all of the work and time you've put into Star Trek fandom, there's this been something that you would continue to love and pay attention to, or has it pretty much gone mostly to your past?
It's still something I love. It's mostly in the past. I don't feel compelled to write more stories the way I felt compelled to write them originally.
Okay, Devra?
That would be for me mostly in the past, and it's been quite a shock the last few years with people saying, look, it's 50 years, tell us about it. And I'm saying, well, I can't really remember all of that stuff that well, but I'd like to say that what we did for love.
And you guys certainly made an impact in getting this material out there and early on into a fandom that is, well, considerably in size and activity even these days.